The first time Rose Garcia walked through Theodore Harrington's front door, she didn't know she was meeting the man who would change her life. It was a Tuesday in early autumn 15 years ago, and she had answered a newspaper ad for a live-in caretaker. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the neighborhood in warm golds and deep reds. Rose remembered how her hands shook as she knocked on the door of the modest two-story house. At 42, with 2 decades of caretaking experience behind her, she still got nervous at job interviews. "You're on time," were Theodore's first words to her. He stood in the doorway, tall and thin despite his 72 years, silver hair neatly combed back, leaning on a polished wooden cane. That's a good start. Rose hadn't expected someone so energetic from the ad's description of elderly gentlemen requiring assistance with daily activities. Theodore showed her around himself, pointing out the kitchen with its outdated appliances, the living room with bookshelves that reached the ceiling, and finally, the small but comfortable room that would be hers if she took the job. "My last caretaker left to be closer to her grandchildren," Theodore explained as they sat in his sun-drenched kitchen. "I need someone reliable, someone who understands that I value my independence but can't do everything I used to." Rose nodded, thinking of her own father and how he had hated asking for help in his final years. "I understand the balance, Mr. Harrington. Being there when needed without hovering." Theodore studied her for a long moment before his serious expression melted into a smile. "Well, let's give it a month and see how we get along." That month turned into 15 years. What Rose didn't know then, what nobody in the neighborhood knew, was that Theodore Harrington was sitting on a fortune. His simple lifestyle and modest home gave no hint of the millions he had amassed through shrewd investments and the sale of his engineering company decades earlier. Rose settled into a comfortable routine. She made breakfast every morning, oatmeal with fresh berries for Theodore, coffee and toast for herself. She managed his medications, drove him to doctor appointments, and kept the house in order. In the evenings, they often sat in the living room, Rose reading aloud from whatever book they had chosen that week while Theodore closed his eyes, not sleeping but listening with complete attention. "My Annabelle used to read to me," he told her one night, referring to his late wife. "Not many people appreciate being read to anymore. Everything's screens and headphones now." Theodore rarely had visitors, but when they did come, Rose quickly learned they were family in name only. They arrived in expensive cars, bringing token gifts and forced smiles that never reached their eyes. There was Charlotte, his niece, who called him Uncle Theo, with a sugary sweetness that disappeared the moment he left the room. James, Gregory, and Paul were his nephews, each more interested in Theodore's health than his happiness. Various cousins appeared on holidays, their conversations peppered with not-so-subtle inquiries about his will and estate planning. "They think I'm senile," Theodore confided to Rose after a particularly tense Thanksgiving dinner. "They talk about me like I'm not in the room, ask if I'm still managing my affairs. As if I haven't been managing affairs since before they were born." Rose had seen it all before in her years of caretaking. Families more interested in inheritance than in the person they stood to inherit from. What made Theodore different was his sharp awareness of the situation. "They'll be disappointed," he said with a mischievous glint in his eye. "I've lived frugally my whole life. They probably think there's nothing left." Rose never asked about Theodore's finances. It wasn't her place, and more importantly, it wasn't why she stayed. She stayed because somewhere along the way the job had become something more. Theodore was no longer just her employer, he had become family. When pneumonia sent Theodore to the hospital during the 5th year of Rose's employment, she slept in the uncomfortable chair beside his bed for 3 nights. His actual family called to check in, but none made the trip to see him. Rose was the one who held the cup of water to his lips, who argued with nurses when they tried to wake him unnecessarily, who brought his favorite robe from home so he wouldn't have to wear the thin hospital gown. "You should go home and rest," Theodore told her, his voice weak but his gaze steady. "You're not getting paid to sleep in hospital chairs." Rose simply adjusted his pillow and said, "Try and stop me." After he recovered, something shifted in their relationship. Theodore began to share more of his past, stories about growing up during the Depression, meeting Annabelle at a dance in 1955, building his company from the ground up. "We never had children," he told Rose one evening as they sat on the back porch watching fireflies dance over the lawn. "Annabelle had health problems. We tried for years, but it wasn't meant to be. She worried I'd resent her for it, but how could I? She was everything to me. Rose understood loss. Her own husband had died young, leaving her alone at 31. They'd had no children either. Maybe that shared childlessness created a bond between them, an understanding of paths not taken. The years passed quietly. Theodore's health had ups and downs, but his mind remained sharp. He still read the financial papers every morning, still called his broker once a month, still tended the small vegetable garden in the backyard with Rose's help. When Theodore's 80th birthday approached, Rose wanted to do something special. She reached out to his family, suggesting a small celebration. The responses were lukewarm at best. Charlotte was terribly busy with the children's activities that weekend. James had an important conference he couldn't miss. In the end, only Gregory showed up, bringing an expensive bottle of scotch that Theodore couldn't drink because of his medications. "Don't look so disappointed," Theodore told Rose after Gregory left early, claiming another engagement. "This is exactly what I expected." Instead of a family party, Rose arranged for Theodore's few remaining friends to visit throughout the week. She baked his favorite lemon cake and found a first edition of a book he had mentioned wanting. They celebrated quietly, the way Theodore preferred. As Theodore entered his mid-80s, his health began to decline more rapidly. Rose hired additional help for the days when his care required more than she could provide alone. She coordinated with doctors, researched treatments, and advocated fiercely when she felt he wasn't receiving proper care. During a heart scare that required surgery, Rose once again camped out at the hospital. This time, Paul and Charlotte made brief appearances. Their conversations with doctors oddly focused on Theodore's mental capacity, rather than his recovery. "They're checking to see if I'm still competent," Theodore observed after they left. "Making sure I haven't changed my will in my diminished state." Rose squeezed his hand. "Well, you're sharp enough to know exactly what they're doing, so that answers that question." In the final year of Theodore's life, as he became more frail, his family visited more frequently. They brought specialty foods he couldn't eat, asked about his comfort while eyeing the modest furnishings with poorly disguised disappointment, and sometimes spoke to Rose with thinly veiled condescension. It must be so rewarding. "Your line of work," Charlotte said during one visit. Her designer purse perched on her lap like it might catch something from Theodore's worn furniture. "Taking care of the elderly, so noble." Rose just smiled politely. "It is rewarding. Your uncle is a remarkable man." What the family never saw were the quiet moments. Theodore teaching Rose to play chess during long winter evenings. Rose helping Theodore write letters to old friends who had moved away. The two of them watching old movies and commenting on how the world had changed. They didn't see how Rose knew which blanket he preferred on cold nights. How she could tell when his pain was bad, even though he never complained. How she'd learned to make Annabelle's recipes just the way he remembered them. On the morning Theodore passed away, Rose was reading to him from a dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, one of his favorites. He had been especially tired that day, his breathing shallow but peaceful. "That's enough for now," he said suddenly, his voice surprisingly clear. "Thank you, Rose, for everything." She marked their place in the book and set it aside. "We can finish the chapter tomorrow." Theodore smiled and closed his eyes. "Tomorrow," he agreed, though something in his voice made Rose reach for his hand. He was gone an hour later, slipping away so quietly that Rose wasn't certain of the moment it happened. She sat with him for a long time before calling the doctor, and then, with a heavy heart, his family. The relatives arrived within hours, their grief performative at best. While Rose packed up her few belongings, she overheard Charlotte and James discussing what they would do with the house, who would get which pieces of furniture, and whether there might be hidden valuables somewhere on the property. None of them noticed how Rose lingered in the doorway of Theodore's study, touching the spines of his books one last time, or how she slipped a single photograph, Theodore and Annabelle on their wedding day, into her purse with tears streaming down her face. What none of them knew, what Rose herself didn't know, was that in just 3 days' time, their lives would all change forever. 3 days after Theodore's passing, Rose stood in front of her closet trying to decide what to wear to the reading of his will. She had received a call from Mr. Winters, Theodore's attorney, informing her that her presence was requested. This surprised her. She had expected to quietly move on to her next job. perhaps helping another elderly person in need of care. She hadn't expected to be included in such a private family matter. It was specifically requested by Mr. Harrington that you attend, Mr. Winters had explained when Rose questioned if her presence was appropriate. She finally chose a simple black dress she had worn to church on Sundays, paired with a worn cardigan that had seen better days. Her wardrobe was practical, not fashionable. Caretaking didn't pay enough for designer clothes, and Rose had never been one to care about such things anyway. The law office of Winters and Associates occupied the third floor of a brick building in the downtown area. Rose arrived 20 minutes early, having taken the bus. She sat nervously in the lobby, watching men and women in expensive suits walk by with purposeful strides. She felt out of place here, like a sparrow among peacocks. A young receptionist with kind eyes looked up from her computer. "Are you here for the Harrington will reading?" Rose nodded. "Yes, I'm Rose Garcia. I was Mr. Harrington's caretaker." The receptionist smiled. "They're gathering in the main conference room. Down the hall, last door on your right." Rose thanked her and made her way down the corridor, her sensible shoes quiet on the plush carpet. When she reached the conference room, she hesitated before opening the door. Through the glass panel, she could see Theodore's family already assembled. Charlotte sat at the table in a black designer dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled, checking her phone with manicured fingers. Beside her was her husband, whose name Rose could never remember. He had visited Theodore perhaps twice in 15 years. Gregory, James, and Paul were there too, along with various cousins and their spouses. The room hummed with subdued conversation. Taking a deep breath, Rose pushed open the door and stepped inside. The conversation halted abruptly as all eyes turned to her. No one greeted her. "What's she doing here?" Charlotte whispered to James. Not quietly enough. "Probably wants to make sure she gets her last paycheck," James replied with a smirk. Rose pretended not to hear as she took a seat in the back corner of the room, away from the large table where the family sat. She clasped her hands in her lap and kept her eyes down, feeling the weight of their stares. A cousin Rose had only met once leaned over to Charlotte. "Isn't that the housekeeper or something?" "Caretaker," Charlotte corrected with a dismissive wave. Uncle Theo was too soft-hearted. Let her live in the house rent-free for years. I bet she's hoping for some kind of handout. Rose felt her cheeks burn but maintained her composure. She had grown used to this treatment from Theodore's family, the way they spoke about her as if she weren't in the room, the way they dismissed her years of care as simply a job she was paid to do. The door opened again, and Mr. Winters entered, a slender man in his 60s with silver-rimmed glasses and a serious expression. He carried a leather portfolio and was accompanied by a younger colleague who wheeled in a small television on a stand. "Good morning," Mr. Winters said, taking his place at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming. Before we begin, I'd like to express my condolences for your loss. Theodore Harrington was not only my client, but a friend of many years." There were murmurs of acknowledgement from the family. Someone sniffled dramatically. Rose remained silent, her genuine grief a private thing she wouldn't display for this audience. "As you know, we're here for the reading of Theodore's last will and testament," Mr. Winters continued, opening his portfolio. "Theodore was very specific about his wishes and revised his will just 6 months ago, with all the proper witnesses and documentation to ensure its validity." At this, the family exchanged glances. 6 months ago had been right after Theodore's heart surgery, the time when Charlotte and Paul had been so concerned about his mental capacity. Now, before I begin the formal reading, Theodore requested that I play a video he recorded at the time he updated his will, Mr. Winters said, nodding to his colleague who pressed a button on the television. The screen flickered to life, and there was Theodore sitting in his study at home. Rose's heart clenched at the sight of him, alive, alert, his blue eyes sharp despite the frailty evident in his thin frame. He was wearing his favorite cardigan, the one with leather patches on the elbows. "Hello, everyone," Theodore began, his voice stronger in the recording than it had been in his final weeks. "If you're watching this, then I've moved on to join my Annabelle, and you're all sitting in Andrew's office wondering what's in it for you." There was an uncomfortable shifting among the family members. Theodore had never been one to mince words. "Before Andrew reads the formal document, I wanted to explain a few things face-to-face, so to speak," Theodore continued. "First, to my family, I know we've never been close. That's partly my fault. After Annabelle died, I withdrew from everyone. But it's also because most of you only seemed interested in me when you needed something, or when you were calculating how much longer you'd have to wait for your inheritance. Charlotte made a small, indignant sound, but no one else reacted. They couldn't exactly argue with a dead man. I've lived simply by choice, not necessity, Theodore went on. Those of you expecting a modest inheritance based on my lifestyle are in for a surprise. The sale of my company 25 years ago, plus some investments that paid off handsomely, have left me with considerably more than most of you realize. Now the family members were leaning forward, sudden interest evident in their posture. However, money doesn't automatically go to those who share your blood, Theodore said, his expression hardening slightly. I've watched all of you over the years. I've seen who calls just to check on my well-being, and who only calls when they need something. I've noticed who remembers my birthday and who can't be bothered to visit even when I'm in the hospital. Rose kept her eyes on the screen, aware that a few family members had glanced back at her with dawning suspicion. And I've also seen who has shown me real care and compassion, Theodore continued, his voice softening, who has been there day in and day out, not for a paycheck but because they actually cared about me as a person. Charlotte stood up abruptly. Is he talking about the help? This is ridiculous. She looked at Mr. Winters. He was clearly not in his right mind. We'll contest this. Mr. Winters raised a hand. Please, Mrs. Lawson, let's allow Mr. Harrington to finish and then I'll read the will in its entirety. On screen, Theodore seemed to have anticipated the interruption. He smiled slightly. I imagine someone is objecting right about now. Probably Charlotte. Always so quick to speak, so slow to listen. He sighed. Let me be clear. I was of sound mind when making these decisions. My doctors will attest to that. This is not about punishing anyone or rewarding anyone unduly. This is about acknowledging who truly acted as family to me in my final years. The video continued for another few minutes, with Theodore sharing a few memories and pieces of wisdom he wanted to pass on. When it ended, the room was silent except for the sound of Charlotte's angry breathing. Mr. Winters adjusted his glasses and began to read from the document in front of him, his voice formal and measured. I, Theodore William Harrington, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils. He went through the standard legal language, then began addressing specific bequests. There were a few minor items. Theodore's collection of first edition books to the local library, a donation to the Heart Research Foundation, his wedding ring to be buried with him alongside Annabelle's. The family waited impatiently through these smaller items, expecting the main event, the division of Theodore's estate among them. Paul was already mentally spending his share on a new boat. Gregory was calculating whether he'd be able to pay off his gambling debts. Charlotte was thinking about the vacation home she'd always wanted. And to my niece, Charlotte Lawson, Mr. Winters read, causing Charlotte to sit up straighter, a smile starting to form on her lips. I leave my mother's pearl necklace, which Annabelle kept in her jewelry box, with the hope that you will think of family legacy as more than just material wealth. Charlotte's smile faltered. That's it? A necklace? Mr. Winters continued without acknowledging her interruption. Similar small sentimental items were left to each family member. His father's pocket watch to James, his collection of vinyl records to Gregory, his fishing gear to Paul. Each bequest was accompanied by a small personal message, some gently chiding, others more nostalgic. As the list of personal items concluded, the family grew increasingly confused and agitated. No one had yet been named as the recipient of the house, the investments, the actual money. And finally, Mr. Winters said, his voice unchanged despite the tension in the room. To Rose Garcia, who showed me more kindness and loyalty in 15 years than my blood relations have in a lifetime, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all properties, investments, and liquid assets totaling approximately $47 million. The room exploded into chaos. Charlotte screamed something unintelligible. James knocked over his chair, standing up. Paul swore loudly. This is a joke, right? Gregory demanded, looking from Mr. Winters to Rose, who sat frozen in shock. 47 million. Charlotte's voice had risen several octaves. That can't be right. Uncle Theo lived in that tiny house. He drove a 10-year-old car. Mr. Winters waited patiently for the outburst to subside before continuing. The will specifies that Ms. Garcia is to receive the entire estate with no conditions attached. Mr. Harrington was very clear about this decision. Rose could barely process what she was hearing. $47 million? It had to be a mistake. She had never asked Theodore for anything beyond her modest salary. She had never even known he had that kind of money. She manipulated him. Charlotte was pointing at Rose now, her face contorted with rage. She isolated him from his family. This is elder abuse. We'll fight this in court. Mr. Winters remained calm. Mr. Harrington anticipated this reaction. That's why he recorded the video you just watched, underwent a full psychological evaluation before updating his will, and had 3 separate doctors sign statements confirming his mental competence. Additionally, I have 15 years of notes from our regular meetings, documenting his consistent desire to leave his estate to Ms. Garcia. Rose finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I had no idea. He never told me. No one heard her over the continued objections of the family. Charlotte was already on her phone, presumably calling her lawyer. James was demanding to see documentation of Theodore's assets. The younger cousins were looking at Rose like she had somehow stolen from them personally. As the chaos continued around her, Rose sat quietly in her corner chair, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had come to say a final goodbye to a man who had become like family to her. Instead, she found herself the center of a storm she never saw coming. Rose sat in Mr. Winters' office the day after the will reading, still trying to process everything. The comfortable leather chair felt too luxurious, as if she didn't belong in it. Outside the window, spring rain tapped gently against the glass, matching her unsettled mood. They're going to contest the will, Mr. Winters explained, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. Charlotte has already filed the paperwork. They're claiming undue influence, saying you manipulated Theodore. Rose shook her head, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her worn purse. I never asked him for anything. I didn't even know he had that kind of money. I know, Mr. Winters said kindly. Theodore told me how you once refused even a small bonus at Christmas, saying you were already fairly paid. He leaned forward. Rose, I've been Theodore's attorney for over 30 years. I knew him well. This decision wasn't made lightly or suddenly. He's been planning this for years. But why didn't he tell me? Rose asked, her voice small. Mr. Winters smiled. He wanted to see how his family would react without you being prepared. He said, and I'm quoting him directly here, I want to see who shows their true colors. Rose thought about the chaos of yesterday, how quickly Theodore's relatives had turned on her, the accusations they'd hurled. They hadn't just been surprised. They'd been furious, as if she'd stolen something that was rightfully theirs. What happens now? She asked. Now we fight, Mr. Winters said, his voice firm. Theodore left funds specifically set aside for the legal battle he knew would come. He wanted to make absolutely sure his wishes were carried out. Over the next weeks, Rose's life changed dramatically. She moved out of Theodore's house. It felt wrong to stay there with everything in limbo, and rented a small apartment nearby. The local newspaper caught wind of the story, and suddenly Rose found herself being photographed going to the grocery store. Reporters asking her questions she refused to answer. Caretaker Khan's millionaire, one headline screamed. Family fights gold digger for rightful inheritance, declared another. Rose stopped watching the news and let her phone go to voicemail. She received hate mail from strangers who'd read about the case and decided she was taking advantage of a helpless old man. Once, someone threw a drink at her car as she drove past. It'll die down, Mr. Winters assured her. The media always moves on to the next story eventually. Meanwhile, the legal battle intensified. Charlotte hired Wilson Reed, a famous estate lawyer known for breaking wills. He subpoenaed all of Theodore's medical records, demanding to know what medications he'd been taking and whether they might have affected his judgment. They're trying to paint him as mentally incompetent, Mr. Winters explained during one of their regular meetings. But we have those evaluations he underwent plus testimony from his doctors. They won't succeed there. When that approach failed, the family switched tactics. They began digging into Rose's past, looking for anything they could use against her. They found that parking ticket from 2012, Mr. Winters said with a dry smile. Apparently that proves you're a hardened criminal. Rose didn't find it funny. The scrutiny was exhausting, the constant feeling of being watched and judged wearing her down. Some days she wondered if it would be easier to just walk away, to let them have the money and return to her quiet life. That's exactly what they're hoping for. Mr. Winters said when she voiced this thought. They want to make this so unpleasant that you give up. 3 months into the legal battle, something unexpected happened. The family's lawyer requested a meeting with Mr. Winters and Rose. They gathered in a conference room at a neutral law office downtown, the atmosphere tense. Wilson Reed, Charlotte's lawyer, spoke first. "We've uncovered some interesting information," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "We've been examining Mr. Harrington's phone records and emails." Mr. Winters opened the folder, Rose peering over his shoulder. Inside were printouts of emails between Theodore and someone named Linda Patterson, dating back several years. "Who's Linda Patterson?" Rose asked, confused. Charlotte smirked from across the table. "Uncle Theo's former nurse. The one before you." Mr. Winters flipped through the emails, his expression unchanged. "I don't see anything concerning here. Just normal correspondence between friends." Wilson Reed raised an eyebrow. "Keep reading." Page 12. On page 12 was an email from Theodore to Linda, dated just after Rose had started working for him. It read, "The new caretaker seems competent enough, but I miss our conversations. No one could replace you, Linda, you see," Charlotte said triumphantly. He didn't even like her at first. This proves she somehow wormed her way into his good graces later, probably when his health started declining and he became more vulnerable. Rose felt a pang reading Theodore's words. Had he really been disappointed in her at the beginning? She'd always thought they'd connected right away. Mr. Winters, however, looked unimpressed. This proves nothing except that it takes time to build a relationship. By the end, Theodore clearly valued Rose enormously, as his will demonstrates. "There's more," Wilson Reed said. "We've also found bank records showing large withdrawals of cash in the months before Mr. Harrington updated his will. Cash that cannot be accounted for." This was a new tactic, and Rose felt a flutter of panic. What were they implying? "Are you suggesting Rose somehow took this money?" Mr. Winters asked, his voice dangerously calm. "We're suggesting," Wilson Reed replied smoothly, "that there are financial irregularities that coincide with the time period when Mr. Harrington changed his will so dramatically in Ms. Garcia's favor." Rose opened her mouth to protest, but Mr. Winters placed a gentle hand on her arm, silently telling her to let him handle this. "Those withdrawals," he said, "were for Theodore's collection of rare coins, which he purchased through a dealer who preferred cash transactions. I have all the receipts, which I'd be happy to provide during discovery." Charlotte's triumphant smile faltered. "Furthermore," Mr. Winters continued, "I find it interesting that you're presenting this as new information when Theodore discussed his coin collection in the video you all watched at the will reading. He specifically mentioned leaving his numismatic treasures to the Natural History Museum." The meeting ended shortly after, with nothing resolved. As they walked back to Mr. Winters' office, Rose felt drained. "They're getting desperate," Mr. Winters told her. "That's a good sign for us." A week later, Mr. Winters called Rose with news. "They've filed a motion to have Theodore's body exhumed," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "What? Why?" Rose gasped, horrified at the thought. "They're claiming he might have been poisoned over time, that his declining health wasn't natural but induced to make him more compliant." Rose felt physically ill. That's monstrous. How could they think I would ever hurt him?" "They don't really think that," Mr. Winters assured her. "It's a tactic meant to drag this out and upset you. The judge is unlikely to grant such an extreme request without compelling evidence, which they don't have." True to Mr. Winters' prediction, the judge denied the motion for exhumation, citing lack of evidence and the distasteful nature of the request. But the family wasn't done fighting. They called Theodore's doctor to testify about his mental state. They found former neighbors who claimed they rarely saw family visiting, but couldn't say whether that was by Theodore's choice or because Rose somehow kept them away. They even tracked down the grocery delivery person, hoping he might have witnessed something inappropriate. What they didn't count on was how these witnesses would actually help Rose's case. Dr. Reynolds, Theodore's physician for the last decade, testified that Theodore had been remarkably lucid until the very end. "He talked about his will with me," the doctor said. "He was concerned his family might contest it. He wanted me to go on record saying he knew exactly what he was doing." Mrs. Patel from next door testified that she'd seen Rose shoveling Theodore's walk in winter, even when her own back was hurting. "She brought him fresh vegetables from her brother's farm," Mrs. Patel added, "always looking out for his health." And Miguel, the grocery delivery person, described how Rose would have Theodore help unpack the groceries, even when it would have been faster to do it herself. She wanted him to stay active, keep his dignity. You could see the respect between them. 6 months into the battle, the tide began to turn. Evidence emerged that painted a damning picture, not of Rose, but of the family. Bank records showed that James had tried to access Theodore's accounts while he was hospitalized 3 years earlier. Emails between cousins discussed how to speed things along. Charlotte had apparently been house hunting for months, looking at properties she couldn't possibly afford without her anticipated inheritance. They've been planning how to spend his money while he was still alive, Mr. Winters said, disgust evident in his voice. The final blow to the family's case came from an unexpected source. Linda Patterson, the former nurse they'd tried to use against Rose, came forward voluntarily to testify. Theodore wrote to me regularly after I moved to Arizona, she told the court. In his last email, just a month before he died, he told me he was leaving everything to Rose. He said she was the daughter he and Annabelle never had, and he trusted her to use his money wisely. Linda turned to look directly at Rose. He was very clear that this was his choice, made freely and with full understanding. He spoke of you with such affection. Rose felt tears well in her eyes. Even now, Theodore was looking out for her. After Linda's testimony, things moved quickly. The judge issued a strongly worded opinion upholding Theodore's will in its entirety and ordering the family to pay all legal costs due to what he called their frivolous and vexatious claims. As Rose left the courthouse with Mr. Winters, Charlotte brushed past her roughly. "You'll never be family," she hissed. "No matter how much of our money you stole." Rose watched her storm away, feeling not triumph but a profound sadness. Theodore had been right about them all along. What now? Mr. Winters asked gently as they stood on the courthouse steps. Rose took a deep breath, looking up at the clear blue sky. "Now I try to be worthy of his trust," she said quietly. "Now I figure out how to honor what Theodore really wanted." What she didn't yet know was that honoring Theodore's wishes would lead her down a path she never expected. One that would change not just her life but the lives of many others, including, eventually, the very family that had fought so hard against her. The morning after the court's final ruling, Rose woke up in her small rented apartment and stared at the ceiling. Despite the legal victory, she felt strangely hollow. For nearly 7 months, her life had revolved around defending herself against the family's accusations. Now that it was over, she wasn't sure what came next. Her phone rang. It was Mr. Winters. "How are you feeling?" he asked when she answered. "Honestly, lost," Rose admitted. "I never wanted this fight. I never even wanted the money." "I know," Mr. Winters said. "That's exactly why Theodore left it to you." There was a pause. "When you're ready, we should talk about the estate. There are papers to sign, accounts to transfer, but it can wait a few days if you need time." Rose thought about it. Putting it off wouldn't make it any less overwhelming. "No, let's do it now. Might as well rip off the bandage." 2 hours later, she sat across from Mr. Winters in his office as he spread out documents across his desk. "This is the deed to the house," he explained. "These are the investment accounts. Here are the bank statements." He pointed to each paper in turn. Rose picked up one of the bank statements, her eyes widening at the balance. "I don't know the first thing about managing this kind of money," she confessed. "Theodore anticipated that," Mr. Winters said with a small smile. "He left instructions for me to connect you with his financial advisor, Diane Henderson. She's excellent and has managed his accounts for years." "Did everyone know about his wealth except me?" Rose asked, feeling a bit hurt that Theodore had kept such a big secret from her. "He was a private man," Mr. Winters replied. "But I think he also enjoyed living simply. The money was never important to him except for what it could do for others." That afternoon, Rose drove back to Theodore's house. Her house now, though it didn't feel like it. She hadn't been back since moving out at the start of the legal battle. The lawn needed mowing and mail had piled up despite her forwarding address. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The familiar smell, a mixture of old books, the lemon polish she used on the furniture, and the faint trace of Theodore's aftershave, brought tears to her eyes. Everything was exactly as they'd left it. His reading glasses still sat on the side table next to his favorite chair. The book they'd been reading together was still there, a bookmark showing where they'd stopped on that last day. Rose moved through the room slowly, touching things, remembering. In the kitchen, the calendar still hung on the wall, marked with Theodore's doctor appointments and the weekly chess game they'd played every Friday night. In his bedroom, his slippers were still by the bed, waiting for feet that would never fill them again. She saved his study for last. This had been his private space, though he'd never forbidden her from entering. Rose had simply respected his need for a place of his own. Now she turned the brass doorknob and stepped inside. The study was lined with bookshelves filled with everything from classic literature to modern mysteries. His desk sat by the window overlooking the backyard garden they'd tended together. On the desk was a leather-bound journal she'd never seen before. Rose hesitated, then sat in his chair and opened the journal. Inside, in Theodore's neat handwriting, was a letter addressed to her. "Dear Rose," it began. "If you're reading this, then the will has been read. The inevitable legal battle has been fought and you have emerged victorious. I never doubted you would. Truth has a way of prevailing, though sometimes it takes longer than we'd like." Rose traced her fingers over his handwriting, hearing his voice in her head as she read. "You're probably wondering why I kept my financial situation a secret from you all these years. At first, it was simple caution. I've had too many people pretend to care about me when they were really interested in my money. But as I got to know you, I realized you were different. By then, I was curious. Would you change if you knew? Would our relationship shift? So I maintained the charade, perhaps selfishly, because I treasured having someone in my life who cared about me for myself alone." Rose wiped away tears. "Oh, Theodore," she whispered. "Now you find yourself wealthy beyond what you ever expected or sought. Wealth brings freedom but also responsibility. What will you do with it? That is entirely up to you. I have no conditions to place on you now. The money is yours, freely given to use as you see fit. But may I offer one suggestion? Remember what it felt like to struggle. Remember what it felt like to be overlooked and underestimated, and perhaps in your new life, you can help others who feel the same." The letter continued for several pages, full of memories and gentle advice. At the end, Theodore had written, "You were the daughter of my heart, Rose. I couldn't have loved you more if you'd been my own flesh and blood. Live well, be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you. With love, Theodore." Rose closed the journal, holding it against her chest as she cried. Not just for Theodore, but for the father figure she'd lost. The friend who'd seen her worth when others hadn't. That night, she slept in her old room in Theodore's house, surrounded by familiar things. In the morning, she woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since before Theodore's death. Over breakfast, she made a list of things Theodore had cared about: education for underprivileged children, medical research for heart disease, support for the elderly who had no family. Then she called Mr. Winters. "I want to start a foundation," she told him, in Theodore's name. Mr. Winters wasn't surprised. "I can put you in touch with people who can help set that up." "What kind of foundation did you have in mind?" "One that helps people who are overlooked," Rose said firmly, just like Theodore suggested in his letter. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, financial advisors, and nonprofit experts. Rose learned about endowments, charitable trusts, and tax implications. She decided to establish the Theodore Harrington Foundation with an initial endowment of $30 million, keeping enough of the inheritance for herself to live comfortably but not extravagantly. "Are you sure about this?" Diane Henderson, Theodore's financial advisor, asked. "You could live like royalty with this money." Rose shook her head. "I never needed much, and this feels right." She established 3 main programs under the foundation's umbrella: one providing home care for elderly people with limited resources, one funding heart disease research, and one offering scholarships to students pursuing careers in caregiving professions. As for Theodore's house, Rose decided to stay. It was modest by millionaire standards, but it was home. She did make a few changes, updating the kitchen appliances that had been old when she first arrived 15 years ago, fixing the creaky step on the back porch, replanting the garden with Theodore's favorite flowers. She kept her old room rather than moving into Theodore's master bedroom. Some spaces still felt like they belonged to him. 6 months after the court victory, the Theodore Harrington Foundation was officially launched with a small ceremony at the local community center. Rose had invited Theodore's doctors, neighbors, and the few genuine friends he'd had. She'd even sent invitations to his family, though she hadn't expected them to come. To her surprise, Gregory showed up. "I didn't think any of you would come," Rose said when she spotted him hovering by the refreshment table. Gregory looked uncomfortable. The others didn't want to. "They're still bitter." He paused. "I didn't come to the hospital when Uncle Theo had his heart surgery. I was on a gambling binge in Atlantic City. Didn't even check my messages for 3 days." He looked down at his punch cup. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately." Rose didn't know what to say. This was the first time any family member had shown any kind of regret. "Anyway," Gregory continued, "I saw the foundation in the paper. The stuff about helping the elderly. It's a good thing you're doing. It wasn't an apology, but it was something." Rose nodded. "Thank you for coming." As the foundation grew, Rose remained hands-on in its management. She visited elderly clients personally, remembering how Theodore had valued dignity and independence even as his physical abilities declined. She read applications from scholarship candidates, looking for the same compassion and dedication she'd tried to bring to her own caregiving work. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when she missed Theodore so acutely that it felt like a physical pain. She would sit in his study, surrounded by his books, and imagine what advice he might give her about a foundation decision or a personal challenge. A year after Theodore's death, Rose received an unexpected phone call. It was Charlotte. "Hello, Rose," Charlotte said, her voice tense but controlled. "I'm calling because I need your help." Rose nearly dropped the phone in shock. "My help?" "Yes," Charlotte said, the word sounding like it cost her something to say. "I've been diagnosed with a condition. It's treatable but expensive. The insurance won't cover the experimental treatment. And—" Her voice trailed off. "And you need money," Rose finished for her. "I wouldn't ask if there were any other option," Charlotte said stiffly. "But the treatment costs over $200,000, and with Paul and I separated now." Again, she didn't finish. Rose was silent for a long moment. This was the woman who had called her a gold digger, who had tried to have Theodore's body exhumed, who had said Rose would never be family no matter what. "I'll help with the treatment," Rose said finally, "but not with a check. The foundation can pay the medical center directly." Charlotte's relief was audible. "Thank you," she said, the words awkward, as if she wasn't used to saying them. As Rose hung up the phone, she looked at the photograph of Theodore on her desk. "Was this what you meant about helping the overlooked?" she asked the smiling face in the frame. "Even when they've been unkind?" There was no answer, of course. But as Rose picked up the phone to call the foundation's medical director about Charlotte's treatment, she felt a sense of peace. Theodore had shown her what true family meant. Not just shared blood, but shared caring. In helping Charlotte despite their history, she was honoring that lesson. "Family isn't about blood," Rose said softly, echoing words Theodore had often repeated. "It's about who stays when it's difficult." She smiled at the photograph. "I'm still learning from you, Theodore. I hope I always will." 3 years had passed since Theodore's death. The maple tree Rose had planted in his memory now stood tall in the backyard, its leaves turning golden in the autumn sunlight. Rose sat on the bench beneath it, a cup of tea warming her hands as she watched birds flit between the branches. At 57, Rose looked much as she always had, her dark hair now streaked with silver, laugh lines deeper around her eyes but still with the same gentle determination in her expression. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a comfortable sweater, showing little outward sign that she was now the director of a multi-million-dollar foundation. "Ms. Garcia?" A young voice interrupted her thoughts. "The new scholarship applicants are here for their interviews." Rose smiled at Lucia, the foundation's program assistant. "Thank you. I'll be right in." The Theodore Harrington Foundation had grown beyond Rose's initial vision. What started as 3 modest programs had expanded to include housing assistance for low-income seniors, a Meals on Wheels service covering 3 counties, and a training program for home health aides. The scholarship program had already helped 57 students pursue careers in elder care, nursing, and social work. The foundation headquarters occupied Theodore's old house. Rose had eventually moved to a small cottage nearby, feeling that Theodore's home should serve a greater purpose. His study remained untouched, preserved as a kind of memorial, but the rest of the house had been converted into offices, meeting rooms, and a community space where local seniors gathered for weekly social events. Rose walked through the garden path to the main house, nodding to staff members as she passed. Inside, 3 nervous-looking young people sat in the waiting area, scholarship applicants ready for their final interviews. Rose had insisted on meeting each candidate personally, believing that character and compassion were as important as academic achievements. "Good morning," she greeted them warmly. "I'm Rose Garcia. Thank you all for coming today." The interviews took most of the morning. Rose listened to each candidate's story, asked about their motivations, and shared a little about Theodore and the Foundation's mission. By lunchtime, she had made her decisions. All 3 would receive scholarships. The one young man with exceptional empathy and a personal history of caring for his grandmother would receive the top award. After the candidates left, Lucia appeared in the doorway. "There's a call for you. It's Charlotte Lawson." Rose nodded, not entirely surprised. Since helping with Charlotte's medical treatment 2 years ago, their relationship had slowly evolved. Not friendship exactly, but a cautious mutual respect. Charlotte had recovered fully thanks to the experimental treatment the Foundation had funded, and in the process, she'd seen firsthand the work Rose was doing. "Charlotte," Rose said when she picked up the phone, "how are you feeling?" "Better than I deserve," Charlotte replied. There was a pause. "I'm calling about the family reunion next month. Paul and I are hosting this year and, well, we were wondering if you'd come." Rose was genuinely startled. In 3 years, she'd built tentative individual relationships with some of Theodore's family members. Gregory occasionally volunteered at Foundation events. James had reluctantly accepted her help when his son needed specialized education, but she had never been invited to a family gathering. "Are you sure the others would be comfortable with that?" Rose asked carefully. Charlotte sighed. "Honestly, not all of them. James is still difficult. But most of us have come to realize that Uncle Theo knew what he was doing when he chose you." Another pause. "And some of us are trying to be better than we were." Rose thought about it. The invitation felt significant. An olive branch, a recognition of sorts. "I'd be honored," she said finally. "Thank you for inviting me." After hanging up, Rose went back to Theodore's study. She often came here when facing difficult decisions or milestones, finding comfort in the space where his presence felt strongest. "Well, that was unexpected," she said to the empty room. "Your niece has surprised me again." On the desk sat a framed photograph of Theodore and Annabelle on their wedding day, young and beaming with hope. Next to it was a newer photo, Rose surrounded by the first group of scholarship recipients at the Foundation's opening ceremony. Rose picked up Theodore's journal, which she kept on his desk. Over the years, she'd read and reread his letter to her, finding new meaning in his words as her life evolved. Today, she turned to a different page, where he'd written about forgiveness. Holding a grudge, he had written, is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I held on to my anger at my family for too long. By the time I was ready to let it go, the patterns were too deep, the distance too great. Don't make my mistake, Rose. Rose touched the page gently. I'm trying, she whispered. The month passed quickly, filled with foundation work. Before Rose knew it, the day of the family reunion arrived. She dressed carefully in a simple blue dress, nicer than her everyday clothes but not flashy. She brought a homemade apple pie, using Annabelle's recipe that Theodore had treasured. Charlotte and Paul's home was a spacious suburban house with a well-kept lawn and flower beds that showed Charlotte's careful attention. Rose sat in her car for a moment, gathering her courage before walking to the front door. Charlotte answered her knock, looking elegant as always, but somehow softer than Rose remembered from those tense courtroom days. You came, she said, sounding faintly surprised despite having issued the invitation herself. I brought pie, Rose replied, holding out her offering. Annabelle's recipe. Theodore always said it was the best he'd ever tasted. Something flickered in Charlotte's eyes, recognition perhaps, or memory. Aunt Annabelle's apple pie. I haven't had that since I was a girl. She accepted the pie, then stepped aside. Everyone's in the backyard. Come on through. The backyard was filled with people. Some Rose recognized from the will reading and subsequent court battles. Others she had never met. Children ran around playing tag while adults clustered in conversation groups. As Rose followed Charlotte across the lawn, conversations paused, heads turned, and a ripple of awareness spread. Gregory spotted her first and raised a hand in greeting. Paul nodded stiffly from beside the grill. James, standing with a group of cousins, frowned and turned away. "Everyone," Charlotte said, her voice carrying across the yard. "Rose is here." There was an awkward moment of silence. Then a small elderly woman Rose didn't recognize pushed forward with the help of a walker. "So you're Rose," the woman said, peering up at her with eyes startlingly like Theodore's. "Theo's Rose, I'm his sister Harriet. He wrote to me about you." Rose hadn't known Theodore had a sister still living. "It's lovely to meet you," she said sincerely. Harriet studied her face intently. "He said you were kind. Said you reminded him of Annabelle, not in looks but in heart." She nodded once decisively. "I see it." Coming from Theodore's sister, this was high praise indeed. Rose felt herself relax slightly. "Come sit with me," Harriet commanded, turning her walker around. "Tell me about this foundation you've started with my brother's money." As Rose sat with Harriet, others gradually approached. A cousin introduced his children. Gregory brought her a glass of lemonade. Even Paul asked a few questions about the foundation's work with veterans. James remained distant, watching from across the yard with undisguised suspicion. When Rose went to get a plate of food, he intercepted her by the buffet table. "I still don't think you deserve his money," he said, without preamble. Rose met his gaze steadily. "That's your right to think so. Then why are you here?" he demanded. "To rub our noses in it?" "I'm here because Charlotte invited me," Rose replied. "And because Theodore would have wanted me to come," James snorted. "You always claim to know what Uncle Theo wanted." "Not always," Rose said quietly. "But I do know he regretted the distance between him and his family. He told me once that pride had cost him years he couldn't get back." Something shifted in James's expression, not softening exactly, but a flicker of recognition. "He said that?" Rose nodded. "He said it was his biggest regret. That's partly why I started the foundation, to bring people together, to bridge gaps before it's too late." James said nothing more, but as he walked away, his shoulders seemed less rigid than before. Later, as the afternoon waned into evening, Rose found herself sitting beside Charlotte on the porch steps, watching the younger children chase fireflies across the darkening lawn. "Thank you for inviting me today," Rose said. "It means a lot." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "When I got sick," she finally said, "I was sure you'd refuse to help." "I would have in your position." Rose shook her head. "No, you wouldn't have." "You don't know me," Charlotte objected. "I know you're Theodore's niece," Rose said simply. "And whatever differences you had, you share his blood. There's good in you just like there was in him." Charlotte looked away, blinking rapidly. "We were horrible to you. The things we said, the accusations. How can you just forgive that?" Rose thought about it. "It's not about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing not to let it determine what happens next." She smiled slightly. "Theodore taught me that, though I don't think he always managed to live by it himself." They sat in companionable silence for a while. "Will you come again next year?" Charlotte asked eventually. "Harriet has taken quite a shine to you, and the children like your stories about Uncle Theo." "I'd like that," Rose said honestly. As the evening drew to a close, Rose said her goodbyes and walked to her car. Looking back at the house, she saw the family framed in windows and doorways. Not her family by blood, but perhaps someday a family of choice. Theodore would have liked that idea. Driving home to her cottage, Rose reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a caretaker with modest savings to the steward of a fortune and a growing foundation. From an employee to the keeper of Theodore's legacy. From an outsider to, well, not quite family yet, but something evolving in that direction. The next morning, Rose sat at her desk at the foundation, reviewing applications for the senior housing program. A knock at her door made her look up. Lucia stood there with an unfamiliar young woman. "This is Bridget Ryan," Lucia said. "She's applied for our home health aid training program. Her situation is, well, I thought you might want to speak with her directly." Rose welcomed the young woman into her office. Bridget was in her early 20s with tired eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. "Ms. Garcia," Bridget began nervously, "I've been caring for my grandfather since I was 16. He raised me after my parents died, and now he needs help. I had to drop out of school to take care of him. But I want to get proper training so I can do better for him and maybe help others too." As Rose listened to Bridget's story, she felt a sense of déjà vu. Here was another caretaker, another person whose life had been shaped by love and duty. "We have a special scholarship for situations like yours," Rose told her, "and we can arrange respite care for your grandfather while you attend classes." Bridget's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Rose smiled, thinking of Theodore, of the journey that had led her here, of the legacy of kindness that continued to grow and touch more lives each day. "Because someone once saw value in me when others didn't," she said simply. "And the best way to honor that gift is to pass it on,"